totally does. It's happening over there. Perfect. Can you use password, please? What's that? Can you use password? Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, yeah.
You're likely muted. Are you?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. I know, I don't think they talk about you can change your mind. Because I think I need to be. And I know that like. Things that are like better.
Okay. We're unmuted. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Unveiling Equity, Tackling Structural Racism. Now, to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube and live from fourth space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And at fourth space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-create daily activities, examining research questions, all types of projects in development here at the university. And today we're running this event as a live streamed Zoom meeting. So we welcome comments and questions via the chat if you're joining us there. For those of you here in the space, if you would like to participate, just let us know. Raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear. But with that, it's very much my pleasure to hand it over to research professional, structural designer, and PhD in education, Concordia, Kathryn Urbaniak. Kathryn, welcome in.
Thank you. Hello, and thanks everyone for joining us here today in person and online. And thank you to the fourth space for hosting us yet again. We're always happy to be here. The session today is titled Tackling Structural Racism, and it's the first of 5 in a series of workshops titled Unveiling Equity. Before we begin, we do have some poll questions that you can complete. There's a QR code, and we can bring the QR code up on screen, please, and we can have a link in Zoom as well. Just to get an idea of where you're coming from, who you are, things like that. So while you're completing that, I'd like to give you a little bit of context about how we came to be here today. So there was a project titled Innovative Social Pedagogy that brought together partners from Chicoutimi, University of Alberta, and a team here at Concordia. And we came to broadly document resilience practices. And from that, we had the opportunity to work with some experts from the Faculty of Native Studies, including Nykkie Lugosi-Schimpf, Avery Latondra, Celina Yellowbird, and Paul Garrow. On the online microcourse they have developed called Tackling Structural Racism, which we'll be drawing on from today. And we've also had the opportunity to work on a French version of that course, and there'll be a French workshop this afternoon. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Firstly, I'd like to present Dr. Vivek Venkatesh. Vivek is a filmmaker, musician, curator, and applied learning scientist focused on building community resilience and tolerance against hate through a public pedagogy approach. He holds the UNESCO chair in the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism and is the co-director for the Center for Learning and Performance here at Concordia. And he's also a full professor in inclusive practices in visual arts and chair of the Department of Art Education. Vivek.
Thanks, Kat. Really pleased to be here, and I'd just like to start off by adding to what Kat and Doug have said in terms of our responsibility in acknowledging the violent history of ecological, social, political, and cultural devastation that's caused by various acts of colonization. I think it's really important to bear that in mind, but to also situate ourselves as an immigrant to, I'm good, as an immigrant to Canada from over 20 years ago. I've had the pleasure of being initiated, being apprenticed in learning about Indigenous peoples First Peoples in Canada and learning about how we can work together to build narratives of resilience, to showcase narratives of resilience, which in fact are created by our collaborators. So I want to just take this opportunity to say that we're trying to build and foster meaningful relationships. There's an individual and a very personal motivation for doing so for me. But importantly, there's also a certain subjectivity that needs to be taken into account when we work with those who are dispossessed. Thanks, Kat. And so, yeah, I'm, as Kat pointed out, a member of Concordia University, a faculty member here, and I'm really proud to welcome our collaborators from University of Alberta, especially so that we can engage in this knowledge sharing initiative. We will continue with introductions, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thanks. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nykkie Lugosi-Schimpf. Nykkie is an assistant professor and academic lead of the Tackling Structural Racism online micro course at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Nykkie.
Thank you for that brief intro, Kat. Hello, Tanse, salut, everyone. As Kat said, I'm Nykkie Lugosi-Schimpf. I am Métis and Cree and Eastern European, originally from Winnipeg, and I have lived in Edmonton now since 2004. And very excited to be here as a visitor to Montreal. My research really broadly focuses on issues of structural racism, how that impacts different everyday social policies, ideas of nationhood. And in the faculty, I teach in areas like the criminal legal system, the education system, and I also teach the Cree language.
Thanks. Now I'd like to introduce Celina Yellowbird. Celina is a young Cree woman that belongs to the Alexander First Nation, just 40 minutes north of Edmonton, Alberta. Celina is Cree and French. Her mother is French from Lyon, France, and her father is Cree from the Alexander First Nation. Celina was born and raised in Edmonton, and she received her undergraduate degree from the Faculty of Native Studies at University of Alberta, and she's currently doing her master's in Native Studies at the University of Alberta, with a thesis focusing on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited folks in the prairies. Celina, would you like to add anything?
I just want to say thank you for having me today. And I'm really humbled and honored to be here in Montreal and to be amongst scholars and talking about a really important issue and talking about something that we worked really long and hard on. So thank you. Hi.
Thank you very much. So perhaps we could just start with some of the principles that you have around generative and respectful discussions.
Yeah, this is something that I know that Nykkie and I have had a lot of conversations about. Perhaps if I could just kick us off here, Celina and Nykkie, in terms of this discussion. One of the things I think is really important when we open a space like this to discuss a sensitive subject is what philosopher Eamon Callan calls intellectual unsafety or intellectual insecurity. To not be so sure about what you know, and to question perhaps your way of thinking, your way of knowing, your epistemology, if you'd like. And how do we create spaces where people can be comfortable about being intellectually unsafe or intellectually insecure? I guess that's one thing I'd start us off with, and like to know how you think about that or what you think about that.
I absolutely agree. Silence has certainly not served different communities that have resisted against oppression, and conversations like this are so important. I think a lot of times folks, perhaps out of genuine concern, coming from a good place, are scared to make mistakes. And especially in a space like university, where we're expected to hold all this knowledge and present well and ask articulate questions. But part of the learning process is ongoing for all of us, whether we're a tenured professor or a student or a community member. It's about asking questions, and sometimes asking really awkward questions to really, I guess, get uncomfortable with or get comfortable rather with being uncomfortable, and asking questions that, that you want to know the answers to. And it's part of the learning process. I absolutely agree.
Do you want to say something about that, Celina?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on and say that, yeah, you do have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because especially with topics like this, it's not easy to unpack or to be engaged in these conversations. And especially, like, I have a lot of people ask me, like, are they allowed to, like, it's just simple things like, are they allowed to wear beaded earrings, or are they allowed to speak on a certain topic? And I think when it comes to allyship, it's always really respectful to ask. And I think that's a really good step, is always asking, and also knowing your positionality to a certain issue. So like if you're, let's say, a white settler and you want to know how to be a better ally to Indigenous peoples, it's always asking, like, what do you need me to do? And the first step is always listening. And that's what I always say, is to always be comfortable just listening, and not listening to have a response, but listening to just better understand, especially topics like this. Like, I know for myself, I'm a continuous learner and academic. And so I'm always reminded that I always just have to listen, especially because even though I'm an Indigenous Cree woman, I understand there's a lot of things that I still don't know. And so that's the one thing that I like recommend to others, really.
Yeah, I like how you framed that, Celina, because one of the things that comes up, at least in terms of reflecting on what you said, was, are we allowing ourselves, whether it's ourselves as pedagogues and our students, to make mistakes, to arrive at faulty conclusions because of a certain rationale that they might have? I firmly believe that freedom of academic expression in a university setting, in a higher education setting, must include necessarily the ability to be able to make mistakes, but to also be able to learn from those mistakes. It's really easy to put that in words, but very difficult to implement in practice, especially in an era where we are being judged very, very quickly, and we're not allowed, in fact, to make mistakes in judgment. So yeah, that's I think where we also want to situate our discussion, because we may not necessarily agree, the four of us, about how we're implementing certain practices, or even whether we have shared values. But at the same time, it's important to be able to bring those to bear in a discussion of this sort.
So in the development of the Tackling Structural Racism course, maybe you could share kind of what's different about this course compared to other kind of pedagogical interventions.
Absolutely. I'm happy to speak to that. So for those of you who are just hearing about the course for the first time, or perhaps you've taken some of it or know a little bit about it, we'll be making reference to it just because this is the latest project that has brought us all together here. So we're not going to go into too many details, rather some of the overarching themes in the course. So what's Tackling Structural Racism? It's a professional development piece that is about 8 to 10 hours in length. And the target audience for this course are working professionals. So it's not for university credit, although higher ed students are certainly welcome to take it. But we wanted a piece out there to tell our stories rather than, it's not a cultural awareness piece. It's not a, cultural sensitivity piece. We come from a position that our communities aren't the problem. Colonialism, structural racism, heteropatriarchy, homophobia, and other systems of oppression are the problems. So we turn the lens that way. And it's in 4 modules. And the first one, and we'll see a screenshot of it later, it's really a landing module to give everyone and equip everyone with common language in social media, in the news, in public, as well as academic discourse. We hear a lot about allyship, we hear about indigenization and decolonization and all these fancy terms. But the reality is a lot of us don't really know what they mean and how to define them, let alone how to recognize them in everyday spaces. So that's what's different about our course. We also then, the subsequent 3 modules, dig in on 3 case studies, areas of K-12 education, social services, family and social services, and then the criminal legal system. And although we could probably have 50 modules for every sector, our hope for our learners isn't to think about, okay, this is how we find a microaggression in ed, for instance, but to think about how we can see them in all sorts of spaces in everyday ways. Another thing that's unique about this course is, and this really is, I think, an ethos of our faculty and all of our, that we teach all of our students and all of our faculty members subscribe to. And that's that our work isn't about pointing fingers. It's not about blame. It's not about perpetual victimhood, but rather to resist out and resist that damage narrative and speak about our communities from the knowledge that we already have. So that's just a quick snippet, and we'll dig into some of those themes there.
I think one of the things I'd like to perhaps ask Kat, Celina, and Nykkie about is contextualizing this issue of systemic or structural forms of racism within the Quebec political context, especially when we have a government that has persistently denied the existence of systemic racism and focuses arguments perhaps on laying blame on individuals, saying that, individuals are racist, the system isn't racist, to a point where some of the conversations also seem to mock the imagery and the linguistics of calling out a system or a group of people or a way of thinking and knowing, or even an epistemology, as racist, as discriminatory. I gave an interview, I remember, to a large media outlet, a video interview, which was posted online. It was edited really well and posted online, where I talked about the roots of structural racism, but also tried to think about ways in which calling out individual forms of racism, while important and while necessary in terms of corrective action, belies some of the more insidious ways in which we are teaching ourselves, the generations of youth who are going to be leaders in our society, to accept hegemonic ways of thinking and knowing, to accept how power structures of different ways, and the way you described, Nykkie, are in fact impacting progress and equitable progress in society. Unsurprisingly, when it was posted on social media, there were comments. Some comments focused on, oh, this is interesting, let's listen to this point of view. Because I was trying to open up a space where I was saying, let's think the way our government is thinking, to see why they're proposing this, but let's also provide another point of view. But then also, unsurprisingly, there were people who said, well, go back to your country. This is what happens when you let immigrants in here. For better or for worse, I've developed a thick skin with respect to this. But as university professors, as academics, as members of a minority community in our own countries, how is it that we can actually break some of these barriers beyond what we're trying to do in these university spaces? I don't know how to be brave about it. We keep talking about creating safe spaces in our universities, but I don't know how to be brave about it. So, and as everyone knows here, my close colleagues know, I'm a bit of a downer most of the time. So I'm trying to kind of find us a way to catalyze perhaps a more uplifting discussion, but I find it difficult. So I guess I'm trying to think about ways in which the current political climate in Quebec is fostering and is promoting a hegemonic oppression. And events like this and discussions like this are really important so that our point of view is made clear and has a place in a larger policy-making orientation.
There's a lot to unpack there. I'll take a start. I'm not going to speak to Quebec specifically because I'm not from here. I'm not a Quebecer. But what I will say is this discourse of exceptionalism isn't unique to Quebec. In fact, we do see it in other places in the world. This idea that just because you may experience oppression, perhaps, in the case of Quebec on a linguistic or a cultural level, doesn't mean that you can't still be reproducing these problematic discourses and practices. Back to your point, I think what you were getting at, Vivek, to put it more plainly, is what's structural about structural racism. And I can certainly speak to that. When we only focus on individuals, we're not looking at a bigger problem. Why might we be hesitant to do this? I think part of it is a lack of education, a lack of good education. When kids go to school, from the time they're school children, they're reading the history of Canada. They're learning what it means to be Canada. If folks are newcomers, they get the Welcome to Canada, Bienvenue au Canada guide. And this is the Canada that everyone has either grown up in or is new to and socializing in. And this country has done a great job, a wonderful PR job, if you will, at promoting this myth of successful multiculturalism around the globe. And we certainly have that reputation. Especially vis-a-vis our, more blatantly racist US neighbor, as it's often framed. So it's a really uncomfortable, really unsettling feeling, I think, to start unraveling that myth that people hold dear. When we talk about racism, a lot of times the more extreme examples come to mind: the front page headlines, the clickbait, or atrocities in history. And so when people are thinking about racism, they're expecting extreme amounts of violence, very overt or blatant, clear-cut examples of hate crimes and hate speech, all the way up to war and genocidal violence. However, racism can happen. And when we talk about it at the structural level, we're not trying to say an institution is racist, as it's often been mocked, right? That's not possible. An institution is a set of buildings and often formal codes and practices and committees. But when the wider political and social culture holds on to ideas that Indigenous peoples are less than, not as smart as, have too many rights and are asking for more, and not legitimate. When certain groups, when we have rampant Islamophobia, anti-Blackness, right? It can often happen just in those day-to-day type of ways. And it's just as violent, even if it's more discursive, as those other acts. And so I think that it's uncomfortable for people to recognize that. Certainly where the education lies is everyone's individual responsibility to keep learning. It's not a one and done. Okay, well, I took a sensitivity course and now I'm done. It doesn't work like that, right? Whether, you're Indigenous yourself or, in a racially marked body, doesn't mean that your learning is done. We're all learning, and a healthy dose of reflexivity, I think, is necessary.
Can I just ask our online facilitators to share the second slide with the definitions? We have a nice diagram that we can kind of keep in mind in the background. But yes, Celina, please.
Just to add on to that, so with my thesis on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited folk, what I'm specifically looking at is how discourse and narratives about Indigenous women and our indigiqueer folk, how that can contribute to cycles of violence that we see specifically in the prairies, because that's where I'm concentrating my research. And I've had, when I explain my research to other people, to those who don't know it very well, they'll ask me, so did they catch the killer? Who's the killer? And so what that does is that it creates as if it's like one individual who's a deviant that we can put into jail and then the problem is solved. But the thing is that that's structural racism, where the MMIW crisis is this systemic problem that is ingrained in society through, and when I'm looking at discourse. And so it's just little things like that, where it's not just one killer, because it's easy to say that, to say it's, oh, someone who's deviant, because it's easy to pull that out and say, well, if we lock them up, the problem's solved. And then when we start to analyze it as a structural issue that needs to be addressed through different multiple layers, then it's difficult, because then people see it as it's part of our society. And for many Canadians thinking, oh, this this is part of our society can be really disturbing because, yeah, we're taught when we're younger that this is a great country, that we're very accepting, that it's a melting pot and all of the great things. But the thing is that that's not the reality. And when, for many people who don't notice that, who have the privilege also of not noticing that, it can be a big shock. And so that's why it's so important to have courses like this, because it teaches people that, yes, it's disturbing, but it's not saying that it's you exactly that's the problem. It's just saying that the society that we live in, there's issues that we can all work to bettering and making things, better in different ways. Yeah.
That was really well put. Thank you for sharing about your research, Celina. It's really appreciated. And not only courses like this, but conversations like this, where we can start to talk about these problems. And, as you mentioned, oftentimes we're looking for monsters in the media, right? Like the bad guy, right? The one off. The thing is, when you look at Canada in its entire history, when we see the same things happen over and over again, this is no longer individual. These are not one-offs. This is a problem. Also, if we wanted to focus on, the madman or the serial killer, these people aren't operating in a vacuum. Not to absolve them of their crime. Absolutely not. It's not okay. But for body counts to get so high, for certain populations to be vulnerable in the first place, tells us something about the wider society and culture. And that's what we need to look at.
So we've had some questions
great.
from the participants online. Thank you very much for that. So one of the questions is, why have we not made progress in reducing structural racism? And that kind of leads into, and then how can we bring about change?
Maybe I could venture a response which we can then discuss. I think I don't want to speculate on why, because I think the answer is multifold. There's a collective apathy, at least if I can address that, there's a collective apathy towards addressing various forms of discrimination, racism set aside, but just discrimination. I want us to remember also, when the government sets aside equity-deserving communities, we're looking at women, regardless of intersectionality, women and misogyny and gender-based violence as being a real problem in society. Indigenous communities, LGBTQ2SI8+ communities, all of these communities deserve a place at the table so that we might be able to understand how to build equitable practices for them. But there's a collective apathy because we are expecting change to happen too quickly. Change takes a lot of time. Change takes education. Change takes investment, financial, cultural, political investment. And we're seeing less and less of that. Maybe there's a sense that neoliberalism is at fault. I'm speaking with a political scientist here who I really like having these debates. Maybe there is a certain sense that neoliberalism is at fault because it promotes a much more individualistic way of thinking and knowing and progress, which assumes that we can work together as a society if we are individually content. But maybe we need to look at more social ways of bringing our communities together to address ills in our society. The second piece around, how do we build capacity to reduce instances of structural racism? I think you need to have a very clear plan. You need to think very careful about what kinds of cultural competencies are we not addressing, are we not appreciating in the diversity that we see in society. So how do we better understand the ways in which we have developed cultural competency based on our identity markers, our sexuality markers, our gender, race, ethnicity, but how do we also appreciate that diversity without necessarily wanting to dilute it and water it down? The other piece I think that's really important is to ensure that we provide support for the development of these cultural competencies. Sessions like this are one way of thinking about it, but having also universities think carefully about what it means to create curricula that are diverse, that open our ways of thinking and knowing to those that we've been exposed to in the past. It doesn't mean that we have to stop thinking through epistemologies which may or may not have been developed through a Western cultural hegemony. It means being able to integrate and diversify the ways of thinking and knowing and not rushing through this procedure. I'll stop there perhaps and invite some discussion around that.
Yeah, I would be hesitant to, even with my political science background, I'd be hesitant to point the finger at neoliberalism simply because racism happens around the globe and it happens in different ways. So it's not a one size fits all phenomenon, certainly not saying that, but who's considered as an outgroup, who's considered as a threat or suspicious or deviant looks different in different spaces with different, political arrangements and systems. So I wouldn't go there. Like yourself, Vivek, I wouldn't, you don't want to point the finger individually or try to tread into why. I think there's a lot of reasons why. Rather, I think perhaps we could reframe the question to, well, why is it continuing then? Right? For whatever reason it started, whatever the motivation is, why does it continue? And I think part of the reason is that we're having the wrong conversations and we're asking the wrong questions in academia, different levels of government, in the public. We want a solution, right? It's also easy to look to legal tools, affirmative action, different policies to fix the problem. But if we're not asking the right questions, the problem is going to continue. And part of it comes from a focus on different communities themselves. Violence, colonialism, homophobia, sexism, racism. These are not problems of communities. These are problems that are deeply ingrained. And a lot of times there's a focus on the outcomes, on social ills and outcomes like poverty, like propensity to violence and criminality, drug and alcohol use, but those have nothing to do with the culture, right? It's not part of Indigenous culture, for instance. And so when it's about cultural awareness training, the idea then is that the problem is on Indigenous peoples themselves, or to be, that need to be fixed or saved somehow. I think we need to shift our questions and our dialogue to what could we all do differently? Yeah. And this is certainly, even spaces like this, I could certainly take us down the path of doom and gloom. There's a lot of that, but there's also, I think, a lot of room for hope. And that's also where we need to put focus on, okay, what's working? Right? As an example, communities or universities, academia, these spaces were not built for the people sitting at this table right now, right? Not even so many decades ago, our Indigenous cultures and languages were banned. Yet here we are, we're in front of university classrooms, we're participating in conferences, we have opportunity to have dialogue. We could even say it in our own languages, such as Nykkie Lugosi-Schimpf, right? And that would have been unheard of even 50 years ago. So to look to our community, and look to our resilience and our own ways of knowing for some of the answers, right? Taking up space, being heard, refusing to be silent, speaking our languages, and so on.
Just quickly, I want to say, yeah, exactly. It's that. It's to just also focus on like that resurgence aspect of this and to focus on how we can move forward. And that's what I'm doing with my research, is looking at how we can move forward and looking within our communities and ourselves and kind of building off of what Nykkie was just saying at the end there. Even the fact that I'm doing research as an Indigenous woman on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a privilege that I can be doing research on it. And to be a voice to all our Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited folk who are no longer with us. And I'm the first one in my family on my dad's side to even go to university, to be in a master's. And so even that, I look at those little instances where I'm like, well, my kukum, so kukum means grandma in Cree, like she would have never, unfortunately, made it this far because of residential schools, because of that. And so I do this in honor of her and all my family members. And that's that resilience piece, that resurgence piece that shows me every single day that we are making progress in some ways. Yeah.
So our audience today is about half public sector, half academic. So kind of to speak to our audience, a couple of the questions that have come up and you've kind of started to speak to is, what do academic norms contribute to structural racism, and how does racism work through funding, hiring, and courses?
Wow.
Great easy one out there.
We're gonna be here all night.
Sure, do you want to, can you just repeat the question again? What do academic courses?
So what do academic norms contribute to structural racism? And then how does racism work through funding, hiring, and courses?
There's a lot to unpack, but I'll maybe start with a very important distinction between freedom of expression and freedom of academic expression. There's a recent lettre d'opinion, so an opinion piece that was published in the Globe and Mail by Jacob Levy, who is the chair of political science at McGill. And he talks specifically about freedom of academic expression. And so, drawing on that analysis has been really important. I've talked about this in a current class that I'm teaching on studio inquiry. We tend to mistake our freedom of expression with freedom of academic expression. I think that when we talk about freedom of academic expression, I brought up one piece earlier around the privilege and the freedom to actually make mistakes in rationale based on a certain epistemology, a certain way of thinking and knowing that's guiding your logic. And so it's important to actually break that down, whether it's done through inductive or deductive means, questioning that, but also having the possibility to discuss why an error may have been made, or the excitement of creating some new knowledge is also important when you pursue those lines of logic. And the other thing I think academically that's allowing us, or that's not allowing us to push forward, is not being able to make the distinction between a political, a philosophical ideal or a value that we hold personally that allows us to become part of a community that shares that belief, and not having the freedom to not be evaluated in a classroom context which doesn't take into account or doesn't punish you for having a political value or belief that may be a heterodox viewpoint. So how do you encourage people who think differently than you, who vote differently than you? And there are so many cases like that in our university community, to actually bring to bear an opinion, but how do we also not punish them for doing so? I'm finding it increasingly difficult to have discussions about sensitive topics in classrooms because there's an expectation that there's only one way of looking at that response. There's a right and there's a wrong. So there are gray areas, and I think that I draw from a lot of the work that's being done by political science philosophers like Chantal Mouffe, who encourages us to be more agonistic in our approach. And so an agonism actually encourages you to be uncomfortable, to express your discomfort, but not necessarily dilute a viewpoint by saying, let's arrive at a consensus. I'll stop there and perhaps have you reflect on it. Great question. It needs perhaps an afternoon workshop to unpack with stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking to the first part of the question, what norms do we see in academia? If we think that there's not a hierarchy of knowledge and disciplines, that is naive, and we need to rethink that. And part of it is that, critical spaces, critical disciplines like Indigenous studies, like Black studies, like gender studies are often, seen as less than, not as methodologically rigorous. somehow just an add-on, like boutique disciplines that are, not interdisciplinary in nature and, just as rigorous, just as knowledge building with their own canons of literature and scholars to draw from, but rather as add-ons to bigger faculties like education, or subfields of just political science or sociology or cultural studies. So there's even a lack of recognition of these disciplines as university disciplines in their own right, with their own methodologies, with their own canons, with their own sets of literature and theories and philosophies. So I think that certainly helps perpetuate these myths. And part of it is taking up space, publishing, going to conferences. It's changing, but it's slow. Academia, like a lot of other spaces, people are really territorial and really protective over their knowledge and their credentials. And it can be difficult to convince, I think, someone to say, you still have learning to do. And it's really about that. I think it's important for everybody, whether it's students or faculty or admin staff, to have that confidence in their work and their ability to learn, but also balanced out with humility, that your learning journey is ongoing. Knowledge is a lifelong pursuit. And just because you were taught one way and, one set of, discipline, one set of disciplinary boundaries doesn't mean that other systems of knowledge, other ways of knowing aren't just as valuable. Part of it there, again, don't want to be here all night, but I'll speak really quickly to the times that we see that in terms of funding and hiring. Again, it's that Band-Aid solution that look for a quick fix. So problems of discrimination, of prejudice, of racism, these did not happen overnight. These are systems that have been in place for hundreds of years. We're not going to undo these systems with one policy. A lot of times, I think to work of a couple of my colleagues, Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lorenz wrote this really cool 2018 piece on indigenization. And a lot of times, it's almost like an add Indigenous and stir type of approach that, okay, well, all we need is just more representation, right? What Gaudry and Lorenz call Indigenous inclusion. It's a very low hanging fruit that, well, let's just have another Indigenous person on a committee. Well, let's hire a Black scholar. But then that doesn't absolve the problem. And that still puts all the work and responsibility and onus on that person, rather than it being a faculty-wide or a university-wide initiative. So that lack of responsibility, we see it happening in these ways. And I think it perpetuates stereotypes as well when scholars of color, Indigenous scholars, genderqueer scholars are burdened with so much service work. Perhaps they're not publishing as much. Hence, reifying stereotypes of, they're not quite good enough, or their research isn't as valuable. They're not as good as us in more traditional disciplines like the hard sciences or the social sciences. And certainly in terms of funding, I think there's just a general lack of awareness of what these disciplines are, right? And what constitutes Indigenous knowledge. And we even see this at, the highest funding levels. Oftentimes, you're not even able as an applicant to select Indigenous studies as your discipline. Rather, you have to shoehorn your work into political science or biology or wherever it might better fit.
Just to speak to that last point Nykkie just made, when I was applying for big grants with the university, with my research, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, I was unable to find specifically Indigenous studies or Indigenous women in violence. I had to exactly go through these loopholes and try and figure out. So at first I would put media communication, because I was like, I'm looking at discourse analysis online, but then no, and that doesn't work because that's not what they look at. Or I would put criminology, but then I would just be ruining my chances of getting a grant, because unfortunately criminology, when they see Indigenous women going missing and murdered, they blame Indigenous women for it. So that's kind of how we see that discrimination, is this for my type of research, I can't find the specific, I don't have a specific category for it. Or even just amongst friends that are in sciences. And when they found out I was in Native studies, it was that common discourse of, oh, that's an easy program. But what many don't realize is that you need critical thinking skills. You need to be able to read. You need to be able to write. And so already these instilled beliefs in many people where Native studies is easy or Indigenous courses are an easy A, which many students in university settings will pick an Indigenous course to get an easy A. And so that tells a lot of where are they getting this information from? Why do they think that way? And then it boils down to the idea that Indigenous people and our knowledges are just myths or legends or less than.
Yeah, I also think it's incumbent on us as members of academic communities who actually have a status, who have the privilege of having a status and a platform to be able to speak about these issues, to lobby our funding agencies, to lobby the government, who are constantly asking for projects that are high risk, high reward. How is it that the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women is not a high risk, high reward? And are you framing it in, as you pointed out, in terms of outcomes that improve society without necessarily understanding that this needs sustained investment? It's not just a question of a 7-year grant. It's sustained investment. I think our funding bodies need to look at this very carefully. And therefore, the onus falls on our peers, our academic peers who are sitting on these review committees, who come back and say, well, you know, this project, it puts maybe a little bit too much of the onus on a potential clash between public safety or policymakers and communities. It's too risky. Well, that's not unacceptable. That's unacceptable as a critique. So again, I think it's important for us to feel secure enough to be able to make these adjustments and provide feedback to funding agencies around this work. And that begins here. It begins with our peers. They sit on those committees.
Just a quick add-on to that, and it's part of the process that researchers go through in academia, is also the expectation that if you do, anti-racist or decolonial or indigenizing work, that you're automatically mining trauma and putting trauma to the forefront. For instance, you apply for ethics, and as soon as you check Indigenous research, you get more pop-ups, more forums online about, well, what types of, trauma will you have in place? Should participants be triggered? So even that assumption that this kind of work is always focused on perpetual victimhood, right? So, just even in the everyday processes and bureaucracy.
So I think we've had some really rich conversation. We have really rich questions coming in from Zoom, but let's turn over to some of our in-person participants and let's get some questions going, hopefully. So would anyone like to pose a question? You have a mic?
Or a comment.
Yes.
Please.
This is a comment from Carrie Lowe. So much ties back to economics. I read somewhere along the way that our economic structures are based on notions of scarcity as opposed to grounded in the ideas of abundance and reciprocity. Scarcity creates negative competition, hence the need to identify as other or less than. Does that make sense or resonate with anyone on the panel?
Sure, I'll start and we'll just do a go around. Absolutely. And that is speaking back to Vivek's earlier comment on neoliberalism. So this idea that, well, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in place and everyone's equal, so there isn't a problem. And then, so if you're starting from a position of, okay, Canada does not have a racism problem, that doesn't exist. Lovely if you're that privileged to think that. But you know, again, in those times of scarcity, it's easy to find a scapegoat or to blame others. And when certain, you know, groups of people have been formed as out groups, as problems of society, it's an easy fallback, for sure.
One of the things that the question catalyzed in me, so I may not answer the question. Like a good academic, I just won't answer the question. I'll just move. I'll answer something else. But what it did catalyze in me was a discussion we had, and we've had for a while, Nykkie, around the deficit model and how your collective pedagogical approach in terms of developing the structural racism course pushes back against the deficit model. And so I thought I'd just maybe query that in case we hadn't discussed it enough here, because I think that's an important thing to describe in terms of how do you frame an issue that is so important to individual communities, which may be misunderstood or not known at all to Canadians, to newcomers like myself who learned about it precisely because of our collaboration. So yeah, that's the only kind of catalyst that I was looking for, is trying to connect it to this deficit model. That's all.
Well, I could start by assigning you several readings,
Good.
but that's not useful here for our conversation now. I think what it boils down to is that when certain communities are only spoke of as perpetual victims, as only damaged, that's where the discourse turns monolithic. And that's a problem. Not to say that there haven't been, you know, negative policies or consequences, you know, with the legacy of residential schooling and so on, but that's not all Indigenous people are. They're not just, you know, empty vessels, if you will, that have only had bad things happen, right? It's a more fulsome look at, but there's a lot more, you know, to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous histories and cultures than just some policies that have happened, right? So when we talk about resisting a deficit model, we're not suggesting that, well, there, you know, we can't talk about anything negative or dark. We absolutely need to put those to the forefront. But if that is all, you know, since childhood that people learn about, it's easy to just see certain groups of people as perpetual victims. And that's problematic. So it's about, again, a more fulsome picture and adding to the discourse.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of a toolkit that we built as part of one of our initiatives for the UNESCO chair that I hold. The toolkit is called Profile or Profilage, and it was designed to help overcome, but also create spaces for conversations around the ill effects of social and racial profiling. After a lot of negotiations, we were invited to work with a community of Indigenous peoples in Val d'Or in the north of Quebec. And it was interesting because we spoke to a couple, in fact, who were in residential schools. And they had very touching testimony, specifically because of the damage, the personal, individual, collective damage that it caused them, but also their resilience in terms of not wanting for that damage to be reflected in the way they were giving back to their society. That particular group of people we met with collaborate a lot with the local Sûreté du Québec, the local police. And so they have Indigenous community members who are hired by and work alongside La Sûreté du Québec, in fact, to find ways in which they can reduce instances of social ills, all the while acknowledging that you need to be able to collaborate with members of the community to understand local experiences. We got a lot of pushback for that, as you can imagine, in terms of showing the diversity and the multitude of experiences, especially in a city which had suffered from various incidents of sexual violence that were being perpetrated against specifically Indigenous women by members of the police. And it was very eye-opening for a lot of us, but it also gave us the opportunity to work with this community to know which aspects of this narrative were they willing for us to talk about and distribute in a public setting. But you're right, this is one way in which we were trying to enact also a better understanding of not falling for the proverbial trap of the deficit model.
Thank you, Kat. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, perfect. So that actually leads really well into my question. Do you think part of the structural racism is really thinking about huge groups of people as like homogenous and thinking like, oh, Indigenous experience is all Indigenous people experience it and have the same viewpoint, or all racialized people have the same experiences and same viewpoint? And do you think that how do you kind of overcome those sorts of ideas within society?
It's a great question, and it's definitely on point with how very, very diverse communities and peoples are often framed. And that's part of it, right? Like this, we call it pan-indigeneity in our faculty, right? And so, yeah, this idea that everybody's the exact same and this is their viewpoint, and even that Indigenous knowledge, like there's only one system of that, right? Without recognizing that diversity. Yeah. I would say that's the same for other groups, are often spoke of as a monolith, right? It's that us versus them dialogue that, and unfortunately in this increasing climate of polarization and populism globally, we're falling into that black-white binary of, us versus them. Here's how we are, here's how our nation looks, and here's the so-called, good citizen, the ideal citizen versus the deviant other. Right. And this is, they're pushing back against us. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job with the question. Yeah.
Hello. So to piggyback on two previous things, Vivek, you had mentioned that often it's very difficult when you're communicating with students to not take sides, and that there's no black and white. And while a lot of us, I think, would agree that there's no really black and white with a lot of things, there are lots of black and white things, right? And at the same time, when you mentioned, when the person before me who asked the question, and you said, how we clump people together, and we assume that because they're a certain color, or they speak that language, or of that religion, or of that background, or whatever, So how do you intersect all of these things as academics? So as humans, we're intersections of things all the time, right? So you're an academic, you're also, man or a woman or a non-binary or whatever, right? So how, when you communicate with their students, I'm still trying to think of it as an academic sense, how do you communicate with your students while still encouraging them to continue to think critically and to make the right steps in things, even when it's not so clear sometimes outside, and when you cannot make that step? You cannot go in and say, I think this way, that's what I stand for, that's what I think, if it's controversial. Like a lot of our Indigenous work right now, a lot of our pro-Black work right now, a lot of it was controversial not so long ago. So there's more things to go from here. As academics, you're supposed to be the leaders of this. How do you stretch it to the next things in the world externally, as political scientists, as activists, as, anti-racist people? How do you extend it to beyond? So we got here, this is great. How do we continue without, I don't know what to call it, because you need to ruffle the feathers, but how do you not lose the people who are not with you on the same line? How do you do it? Because the magic happens in the classroom. I still believe that.
Yeah, maybe I can kick off the answer. Thank you, Rauda, for that question. I think there's a sense amongst pedagogues that we need to uncover in what ways we remain authentic to ourselves when we are teaching. And so authenticity as a construct is important. Lauren Bialystok from OISE writes, I find, in a very lucid way about this. But making personal decisions as you're negotiating reading materials that you are undertaking for a class, as you're preparing a pedagogical sequence in a class, and thinking, okay, where do I stand on this issue? How do I want to present where I stand on this issue? Because as a pedagogical leader, you are in control of the discussion in the class. Regardless of if you're facilitating, as you give up control, so to speak, in terms of the classroom discussion, you still are in pedagogical control in the sequence of the class. So in what situations must you remain authentic to yourself? Because if you ascribe yourself to, let's assume, a liberal position, Western liberal position, and you encourage people to talk about xenophobia, and people ask statements or make statements around minority communities that are benefiting from specific policies that allows them to have more equitable access to institutions. And questions come up around, well, their performance is deteriorating. It reduces the quality of my experience in the class. So to what extent do you actually have to allow that discussion to be pursued so that you can actually enable learning to take place, so that you can actually come to a point where the conflict or the cognitive dissonance that you are seeking in the class is achieved because people are discussing these very, 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 very serious topics which don't necessarily make you comfortable about them. So authenticity is a big issue there. When do you make the decision to say, okay, I am not going to allow this discussion to take place, and I'm going to explain why that's the case? Because there are certain immutable human rights issues that I will not allow you to violate in this class. So a lot of it is, in diction, in tone, in the way you're presenting yourself, whether you choose to walk around the class and loom, so to speak, or whether you kind of stay back and think about, okay, if people are making an effort to be part of the conversation or lead the conversation, how do you focus attention there as opposed to yourself as an instructor? Yeah, I think that's kind of an initial reflection that I have.
Yeah, I think that in a faculty of Native Studies, we are always dealing with the gray. All of our professors and most of our students, I mean, just by the titles of the courses that are often electives, right? Colonialism and the Criminal Legal System. It's a senior undergrad graduate course. When folks sign up for this course, they already know what they're getting into. I think so there's an expectation that we're going to talk about very dark topics. We're going to talk about some very controversial topics. In terms of how I negotiate that in the class, I don't see my job as telling my students what to think, but rather how to think for themselves and how to find that information. So while, it's not about what my viewpoint is, I think that if I had students writing papers that they thought, well, I don't really believe this, but I know I'll get a good grade because she thinks that way, I will have failed in my position. I would never want that. I've had papers from students, and personally, I don't necessarily agree with them, but that's not what it's about. Are they citing the literature? Can they support their point? As Vivek, as you said, there would be no tolerance for hate speech or something just blatantly inappropriate. That's against the student code of conduct. But again, the privilege of teaching these kinds of classes in a critical faculty, I think mitigates a lot of that. I've had similar questions at other conferences and events where people will ask, well, how do you convince or bring people to your viewpoint who don't want to? And I think that we're not talking to a wall. It's not up to me to try to convince someone else what to think. Would it be great if we could all have a discussion? But it's about building dialogue. And I'm not going to change the world. I'm not going to change everyone's mind. I'm not even going to try to do that. I think that's where that humility piece comes in about what can I do and where can I build dialogue and continue relationships with people who want to learn and want to learn alongside me and with me and in these spaces.
So just to add on to what you're saying right now in terms of like I guess positionality in the classroom and stuff. Could you speak a bit more about the Faculty of Native Studies itself and how the course is kind of emergent from the faculty as a unique entity within a colonial institution, but also maybe also if you can speak about resiliency, because resiliency comes up a lot when it comes to Indigenous peoples. And when we talk about resiliency, and I think resiliency also sort of goes towards BIPOC people in general, but specifically about Indigenous resiliency. I would love for you to hear your comments, Celina and Nykkie, about it. What is that? What does that mean to you as Indigenous women and as Indigenous scholars? But also like critically, what does that mean? Like, are we putting upon it like a deficit model to that? I know how are we, interpreting that and pushing ourselves, maybe some sort of colonial values on it? I know I would love to hear more about that term because it comes up a lot, right? It's like almost like the new buzzword, like identity, so yeah.
So I'm going to answer a different question and then I'll get back to what you're asking. We're going to get there. We're just going to take the longer route. Absolutely. Resiliency, we could consider a new buzzword in anti-oppression and certainly Indigenous studies work. It comes with a caveat, right? Because a lot of times when we talk about resiliency, again, there's that focus on the individual that, well, they need to be resilient. And if they aren't, they're somehow failing or they're somehow weaker. I'll go back a bit more directly to the question now. I think it's about, and this leans in on something that Celina said earlier, and it's about listening. As academics, we're great at, critical thinking, critically reading and writing, but critical listening is really key. And it's about looking at multiple stories, listening to multiple stories in different places and offering that in the classroom, and not privileging necessarily one community knowledge over another. I think that focusing on the diversity of our communities, for focusing on this, is where resiliency comes in, not at an individual level, but as a collective to share stories. I'll give an example from my Cree class. A lot of times people think, oh, Cree, that's spoken right from, the Alberta, BC border all the way up to Northern Quebec. A lot of folks don't know that there's 5 different dialects. And even within that, there are regional variations, example, in Edmonton, we would say eha to say the word yes. Only an hour north, they say ihi. Okay, so even pronunciation, but even in terms of the beliefs, there's not a one size fits all belief. So sometimes in the classroom, we do have a unit actually on, cultural science and cultural beliefs, but this is very localized, very situated knowledge. So, for some of the students, and they're welcome to share, oh, in my community, we actually think about owl in this way, or we think about rabbits like this. And it's not about, well, there's a right or wrong way. And I really discourage my students from looking at, oh, well, this is the way, or just because this is the way we conjugate a verb in a book, right? That's not necessarily how we speak in community, right? But to say that regional variation is the beauty of the language. And I think that's where resilience comes in, is this acknowledgement of the diversity, of the multiplicity. And again, it's not that, well, here's the top down, the right, wrong, just simply a different way. And I think that builds capacity for our students, and that builds resiliency in them to be proud of who they are, to be excited about learning different things.
And tying to that, resiliency, what tends to happen is that, it blames the individual kind of simultaneously. And so it says, well, and it constructs it in terms of like Western ideals of what resiliency looks like. So for many, it's like, to be resilient, it's you're going to go to high school, you're going to graduate high school, you're going to go to university, you're going to get a job here, you're going to speak this language, you're going to be part of society. But the thing is that, from an Indigenous woman perspective, that's not the way it works. And there's actually like a really good article called, it's from Defini, and it's 2018, I believe. And it talks about resiliency, and it talks about actually how to create body sovereignty amongst young Indigenous peoples. It's to tie resiliency and to construct it through Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So what that looks like is that resiliency can look like learning to speak your language. So what Nykkie was talking about, the Cree language, and that builds resiliency and it brings confidence because you understand where you're from and who you are. And so it's resiliency should be tied to, let's say, tribal sovereignty, nationhood, things like that. And so for myself, I can only speak for myself. For me, resiliency, that's what it looks like. It's learning to speak Cree, knowing where my family's from, giving back to community, dancing in powwows. It's things like that. For me, that's resilient because, and I'm embodying body sovereignty through that, as the law and colonialism has strived to push Indigenous women out and to kill Indigenous people. For me, practicing my culture is resilient because I'm pushing back against that and not succumbing to what white settler society wants me to do in terms of their way of conceptualizing resiliency. Yeah.
Hi, and thank you so much for this conversation. I have two questions that are really related. So the first one will be, as someone who's racialized, how do you navigate tokenism within the academia sphere or even someone who's working in the public sector? Because we know that if you're racialized or you come from a specific community, you will always be a token in a way from some project or just, how can I say, like an object of curiosity in a way. And then the other question is how to be a better ally for racialized and non-racialized. And how can we know when we can step in without taking the space of the person? Thank you.
I'll get us going. Another easy to answer question. Thank you, Sophia. How to resist tokenism. That's what you're talking about there. Yeah. I think having the courage to say no. A lot of times as racialized folks, I know from my own experience and even conversations we were having last night, identifying as women as well, a lot of times we feel like we can't say no, that we have to say yes to everything. But part of, self-care, we're not going to do any good work for anyone if we're burnt out. So it's also learning, I think, to say no, that no, I won't be on that committee. I'm at capacity. Learning to say no, and also learning not to apologize for it. I'm busy. That's it. Thanks. Please consider me in the future for another opportunity. And that's easier said than done. I realize that, but it's I think, important part of not being tokenized is refusing to. And I also recognize that as a professor on the razor's edge of getting my tenure, I'm in a privileged position to be able to say that, because as a graduate student, or let's say I was, first year on the tenure line, it's very easy to feel like you have to say yes to everything. Otherwise you won't be considered for promotion. You'll be seen as, lazy or resistant and whatnot. So I recognize that as well. In terms of how to be a good ally, it goes back, I think, to listening and also, knowing your place. Right. Even, as an Indigenous woman, I don't speak for all Indigenous women. And, as an ally to not only my own communities, but to other BIPOC folks, it's about speaking with and speaking together, not speaking over or solving other problems or speaking above or retranslating. Oh, what you mean is, right? That's not acceptable. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, knowing how to say no and saying no without apologizing is a really big thing. Because I know for myself as a grad student and also being in an undergrad, I was given a lot of opportunities, which I'm really grateful for. But I got into the habit of saying yes to everything and compromising my mental health and my energy. And it was really unfortunate because there were times when I wasn't getting paid for the work that I was doing, that, well, I was tokenized. So every time they needed an Indigenous person to talk about something, it was me, but I'm not knowledgeable on everything. And again, that's pan-Indigenizing, assuming that just because I'm Indigenous, I know everything about Indigenous culture, language, traditions. So yeah, it's learning to say no and to be unapologetic about it and to just say, no, I'm not going to do that. Simple as that.
I agree with everything that that Nykkie and Celina have said. Maybe to take a different tack, and thank you for the question, Safia. I think as managers of teams, as project leaders, academics who work on projects that involve creating as well as setting expectations for the team, we have to be very mindful to diversify the ways in which we hire into those teams. We talk about this a lot in our own work. How is it that we make sure that if we're discussing an issue as complex as discrimination, xenophobia, that we include people from communities who have, in fact, experienced the gamut of problems associated with this, that we include people who may have different values than we may have in those discussions, but carefully curate the functioning of the team so that we all understand that there is a vision that we're working towards. There are priorities that need to be met. And so we'll make decisions which might be unpopular with some and might meet other people's expectations more. And managing those expectations, having people work together with that diversity of experience is so important, because I think avoiding tokenism then tells us that we can be nuanced in our approaches. Just because I look a certain way, I identify a certain way, I wear certain things, doesn't mean that I necessarily have to embody a larger ideal. And we're losing that power a little bit. It's not that we're not capable of being nuanced, but we're losing a little bit that power. And so, diversifying the teams, making sure that we have enough downtime to actually talk about what it is we like and dislike. What do we watch? What do we listen to? How is it that, oh, somebody who looks like that actually does something I like? Just making that dissonance happen is super important, I think, so that we stop putting people into specific boxes and saying that's how they should be behaving or how I think they should be behaving. Thank you for the question, though.
Thanks. We actually have a comment from Mary Jo Vanador, which says, have you all had the experience of being told you're a fine example for your people? Gosh, that gets old.
Yes.
Yeah, no, actually, no, nobody thinks I'm a fine example. No, especially my kids. They're like, oh God.
Yes, and it's with hesitation that I discuss this, and it ties in really nicely, I think, with what we're talking about and the nuances of everyday structural racism, because it's almost said, it's veiled as a compliment. It sounds like a compliment, right? We're going to call it what it is. It's a microaggression, right? And it's, wow, you're so smart. You're a real credit to your race, or you're a fine example. And I want to ask, well, what did you expect? Right? Because although that is packaged as a compliment, it's telling me that, well, for me to be an exception or somehow this spokesperson, this reveals something about how you think about Indigenous peoples otherwise and where you think they should be.
So another question from the chat is, how do you tackle pushback from people who call EDI reverse racism?
Actually, it's not been put in those terms, but I invite the conversation to take place. I've been in some really interesting discussions with mental health, social service providers, where the question of reverse discrimination comes into play. I talk about this a lot at home as well, in my own family, because we're a mixed couple and our children are mixed. And so there's a different kind of minority status at home. There's more colored people at home than non-colored, which makes for an interesting dynamic. But I think I'd invite the conversation. I'd want to know, what is the misgiving? Is the misgiving that an opportunity that was made available or that could have been made available to you was not, because an equitable way of thinking and knowing and proceeding ensured that someone from a larger group that has not had this opportunity is now occupying that position? Of course, it's difficult. It's very difficult to contend with that emotion, contend with the emotion of dispossession, so to speak, that you may feel as a person from a majority society. But how do we actually invite the conversation so that we don't mislabel and misnomer this concept of reverse discrimination? The bigger issue here is, what do they mean by the E in EDI? Do they confuse equality with equity? Right? Aren't there distinct definitions for those? And maybe there's something that's more basic around understanding the notion of equity as providing access, equitable access to a group of people who have been marginalized, who are vulnerable, who've been dispossessed. Yeah, so I think I'd invite the conversation, but I'd be very guarded, very, very guarded about doing so.
Yeah, and I think there's also a big difference between EDI initiatives and affirmative action, which is what it sounds like. So even a bit of a, perhaps conflating some of those terms. But that aside, I think it's also a symptom of how polarized politics are becoming in our societies, where everything's a zero-sum game. That to somehow talk about equity, right, is all of a sudden to point the finger and look for another bad guy. That's exactly what we're trying to dismantle, to have good relations again. We want to have good relations. And we want to, to make decisions together and work together, as opposed to this zero sum, right? Where there's winners and there's losers. That, okay, well now, based on your race, you don't deserve the job as much as, say, as someone who's Black or Indigenous, right? And, the EDI, while well-intended, sometimes how it happens in practice, I think, is greatly misunderstood. Or a lot of times, hiring committees or simple inclusion, as opposed to, teaching folks about the need for equity. And that was a really sharp distinction you made, I think, Vivek. And one that we take up in our course as well, in that module 1, when we're talking about common language. There's an idea that, we're a merit-based society, the old, bootstrap myth of, you just work harder, without recognizing that, well, some people do face barriers based on different markers of identity or how they're perceived by others. Yeah. So yeah, like yourself, I would welcome the conversation and even clarification of terms and even really learning and prodding and building dialogue and getting to the root of why people feel that way. Because I think a lot of times, if you just ask, well, what makes you think that? Or why would it be reverse racism? Right? You end up with a different conversation and you get at something different, and you can't have that dialogue if you don't start asking those kinds of questions. If it's just automatically canceling or shutting folks out, that's where we get into problems. And this is where we started, with uncomfortable conversations that, sometimes people aren't coming with ill intentions or with hate, but honestly not knowing why, or thinking, hey, I've heard this is reverse racism. Right?
Yeah, you're right. If I could just add to that, we tend to fail at these kinds of discussions because we're looking too quickly for that mic drop moment, right? We just want to showcase how right we are and how wrong you are, and we put you down. There's an ad hominem attack, and you just walk away from the discussion. There's place for that. There's place for that in a group of people with whom you're comfortable, and you say, oh, you won't believe what somebody told me yesterday. Talk about it, you chuckle and go, all right, we're here to support each other. But when the conversation is going to be difficult, please don't drop the mic. It's so unbecoming of civil society. It really is. And so how do we build that that sentiment that, okay, I'm going to be uncomfortable about this, and it's not for me to win an argument here. It really is about making sure that that space becomes really rough and entangled. It's very difficult to do. You have a mic that you can drop at some point in time. I don't. I'll have to pull this out of my pocket and.
Yeah, they really don't want us dropping the mics.
Yeah.
Kind of a very direct question from the chat is, how do I recognize unconscious bias in myself?
Yeah, I don't feel qualified personally to answer that question. I don't necessarily want to relate personal experiences with regards to it. But yeah, just let me ponder it for a bit.
I'd like to thank the participant for that question. I think it takes a lot of courage to put that in, put that out there. And that's up to your own learning, I would say, right? Educate yourself. We all have the opportunity. I mean, whether we're in university or not, there's a lot of good information out there, and it's about seeking knowledge, right? Learning and even just challenging yourself and ask why. Like, why do I think this? Or how did I come to know that? Right? How did I arrive at this opinion? So just to be asking yourself and looking to educate yourself in different ways.
The places where, or the moments where I know I have learned about my unconscious biases is when I've been surrounded by people who actually tell me and who feel comfortable telling me and who say, whoa, that's not on, Vivek. That's really offensive. Or why would you say that? Or how, you need to be mindful about it, whatever is said. So those are the times when I've learned about my unconscious biases, is when people have felt comfortable enough. And in a certain sense, it's the risk that they take telling me, because they might be worried that the relationship might not last that particular the outcome of that conversation. So yeah, I think it's down to hopefully surrounding yourself with people who feel like they have your trust and confidence to tell you it's not on. That's really important, I think.
Yeah, so I think the general consensus is to push yourself to continuously keep learning every single day, because like you stated in your question, it's unconscious. So sometimes it won't be immediate, like you won't know right away that you have this certain belief, internal belief. It's only when you have conversations with others and you hear different point of views, or you pick up a book that challenges you a little bit, where you can see, oh, this is actually, I didn't think this way before. And that's when you can kind of pinpoint, okay, that was possibly an unconscious belief. That was possibly something that I learned somewhere in school or from friends. So it's always pushing yourself. And again, back to that topic of being uncomfortable and being okay being uncomfortable. It's okay. And when you're uncomfortable, that means that you're pushing yourself in different ways, to learn more, to be a better person, or et cetera. So yeah, it's also hoping that you surround yourself with good friends also that are able to tell you, hey, I think that's a little out of touch, and this is why. And that's the thing, is that when we have these conversations, sometimes it can get really heated and you want to shut them down or cancel them. But I think, if we also want to be good relational people, it's to, of course, respecting your own boundaries and what you can handle, but like being able to calmly educate someone and tell them. And also when people ask you, oh, well, can you tell me why? To just tell them, you know what, do your own research. Pick up a book. The internet is free. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. Oh, yes, please.
I guess this is a bit of a follow-up for that. How do you create an environment in your classroom, or I guess your workplace, where consensus doesn't need to be built, where we can have these conversations without people feeling hyper uncomfortable? Well, I guess they will be uncomfortable, but more than uncomfortable, like where they feel attacked or put out by having these conversations. How do we build? I feel like we are so polarized now that it's hard to even create a space for these conversations.
Yeah. One of the delimiting characteristics of at least the spaces I try and create pedagogically is to acknowledge what we control and what we can't control. So when we're having a discussion in a class, thinking through a theoretical concept, thinking through the ways in which we enact them, understanding that the discussion needs to remain at that level, that it's fluid. People might want to bring that into practice for their art, for their policy making, for their teaching, and helping them to actually push that forward is separate from having a discussion about it. I think that's important, delimiting. And that doesn't mean that it's less important because we're just academics or students and teachers in a classroom. It's also a way for us to be able to protect ourselves as we're having that discussion and say, okay, here's what the impact of this discussion might look like, and I can pursue it later. The other part as well is to not necessarily get into a class every time you teach the class and say, okay, guys, time to get uncomfortable. I hope you're all quaking in your boots. Let's do this. And, let down your guard. No, it'll happen, I think, organically. Not every part of every class needs to be extremely heightened in terms of tension and needs to be delving into the gray areas in a sensitive topic. I think allowing for that to happen naturally, not denying that it can happen, not necessarily focusing on trigger warnings. I don't necessarily agree with that at all. I also, as Celina said, would like people to take responsibility for what they're learning about. So having people do the work and come back to reflect on it at another point in time. We don't need to resolve that issue during the 2 or 3 hours of class. We can come back to it. We can have a discussion online. We can build some forums where people who may not want to speak up in class, which is totally normal. I was that kind of an undergrad student, even graduate student. I'd prefer to reflect on it, write a little bit about it, share that with a group of people with whom I have some trust or confidence. So kind of just ensuring that it's not a situation where you're coming in completely full in your armor because you know you're gonna get whacked. Yeah, that's how I see the situation developing. Yeah. Yeah, and a statistics class doesn't have to be controversial. I'm a statistician by training, which is why I'm saying this. It doesn't have to be controversial, but I think a critical theory class should be. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. While content warnings certainly have their place, and that's just part of being aware of who your students are and realizing that, some of the material, just statistically speaking, some people may have experienced some of these things. With Indigenous studies, we're a small and very tight-knit faculty. And so about half of our students are Indigenous. Many are local to that area. So we're not just reading and learning about theories in a book that are abstract or, 500 years removed from history, but rather, we're learning about things that affect either ourselves or our families or our close friends. So, we'd have to, except for the Cree classes, I think we'd have to do a trigger warning every class. You never know what will trigger someone. So yeah, I agree, right? To encourage people to come in guns a-blazing isn't useful. In the classroom, it's also about sticking to the topic, I think, and not making it personal, right? That people can share different opinions and think through, and, not to say like, oh, well, what do you think? And put that on the student, but rather, what might someone arguing a different position, how would they approach this topic? So if you keep it about the theories, if you keep it about the literature, right? And folks may feel comfortable and want to share personal stories, and that's perfectly okay, and often do in my classes. But then it doesn't turn into an argument because it's not about personal, well, I'm right and you're wrong. It's about, hey, I come to this because I have my own experience with, with whatever they'd like to share. Yeah, so I think it's just about focusing on those spaces. And our faculty does a really great job, I think, of helping our students navigate the distinction between upsetting or unsettling material and triggering material. A lot of, psychology terms are being misused and thrown around. We see it on social media, and we see students adopting that approach, which can be problematic, right? If we're talking about police brutality, if we're talking about residential schools, Those are awful topics. You shouldn't feel good. Anyone learning about those topics, whether they have, direct or indirect experience or not, shouldn't feel happy. But there's a big difference between feeling, triggered, as in activating some kind of past trauma, and feeling uncomfortable with the material. So even talking about, having a space to talk about how uncomfortable the material is or how upsetting it is a different conversation. I think that way too, it creates a safer space, because then if students do actually feel triggered, you can have a conversation about that on the side. Find supports for the students and such.
Thank you. We have a comment and a question from David Waddington. Thanks for sharing. So Elizabeth Anderson argues that terms like systemic racism are not effective outside academic contexts. She comments, first, outside of academic and progressive circles, almost no one talks like this, especially among whites without a recent college degree. This term racism is reserved to express moral, I don't know how to say the next word.
Opprobrium.
Opprobrium. Okay, directed at the most hateful individuals. Second, because the term racist is used with such wide scope, it often leaves addresses in the dark about what is wrong. This is particularly problematic in the United States, where moral discourse tends to be highly individualistic. It presumes that if something is wrong, specific individuals have to be at blame. Anderson concludes it would be wise in communicating concerns about problematic racial phenomenon across lines of party to describe moral problems concerning race in terms that are not only used as insults. Instead of calling conduct racist, one could describe how it hurts others in ways that implicate racial identities. How would the panelists respond to Anderson's concerns about how we communicate with the public about systemic racism?
I can maybe take a stab at this. Thanks, Dave, for the question. It's not just an issue about linguistic juggling, right? I think it's about making sure that when we do address the issue of systemic racism, and that we want to have policymakers acknowledge it, that the conversation is directed to them. I'm thinking specifically about the interview that I gave to Le Devoir, where I described the concept of systemic racism. I also compared how individual acts of racism, or ascribing those ills to individual acts of racism, does not allow us to actually come to a better understanding of the topic. I haven't read this piece by Elizabeth Anderson, but my understanding of what has been quoted here is perhaps a call for us to be able to work with the larger public in terms that make sense to them, right? In terms of outcomes that make sense to them, in terms of actions that make sense to them. Because being called a racist is, and this is not my quote, but several conservative thinkers have thought about this, have spoken about this, and have said that being called a racist now is what is considered as vile as what one would be expected to receive should we be called a pedophile, right? So it is so far removed and tangential to what we expect in society that you don't want to be called a racist. And so there's also this fright, right, of being called out, of being canceled, so to speak. So what do we do here? How do we approach this topic in terms that are relevant to the public? It's not because we speak in theoretical constructs and want to enable our policy making to shift that we shouldn't continue to call out what we see as systemic or structural forms of discrimination. But yes, having a discussion with the public needs to be had on a collective set of terms that we understand to be defined equally. And then we can actually think about, okay, where do we see this differently?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's about meeting your audience where they're at. I'm going to speak differently to a graduate classroom than I would out in public. And so I'm not trying to say I would be watering down or dumbing down or simplifying. but rather, in different spaces, we have, different lingo, different norms, different, secret handshakes, I guess we could say.
Yeah.
Right? And different ways that we relate and communicate. So it's about communicating to different audiences and knowing that. And absolutely about coming to terms with definitions, because a lot of these conversations, going back to the polarization piece, are polarized. It's this idea that, well, if you're doing something wrong, it's about pointing blame. It's about being labeled as a racist, right? That's not what the purpose of learning about structural racism is, and it's been greatly misunderstood. So I think that even coming to the table and laying out a set of definitions and even asking some questions about, okay, well, what exactly is? So Vivek, you were saying that, first you just unpack that concept. It's misunderstood often, and it's not about individuals. Rather, it's about learning about perhaps just wider cultural assumptions that are often unquestioned. So what we're doing is we're bringing the invisible to the fore and talking about that. I just end before I offer the mic to Celina. How would I respond to, perhaps talking about hurt feelings? I think that by not naming racism when we see it is the problem. I think that's why it's an ongoing problem. So trying to water it down and package it, it's not necessarily about hurt feelings or hurt emotions, right? Racism is racism, and I think it should be called out. And again, it could be more about the behavior, especially if you're in a workplace and this is a coworker of yours. I don't think that there's any value in your relationship to say you're a racist. That will break down dialogue. It's always about dialogue, right? And how do you get there? Not by pointing fingers and name calling. I think then it's about, hey, why do you think that? And this behavior could be seen as racist, right? That comment is hurtful because, right? But again, not about pointing fingers and laying blame, but looking at why it's an issue in the first place. Yeah. And thank you, Dave.
Yeah, and the fact that the topic of systemic racism is something that we want everyone to be implicated in. We want to avoid using jargon, so big words, because then it creates these these disparities, and it creates where it's not accessible to everyone, because not everyone is getting a graduate level and learning about these terms in depth. So it's about if we do, because some words are perfect to explain something. So systemic racism, I'll use it. And if someone doesn't understand it, then I'll unpack it. And exactly, it's to not water things down. If someone is being racist, it's to be yeah, you're being racist because of this, this, and this. So I think it's always appropriate to just think about who your audience is and who you're talking with. And because sometimes people can use these big words to seem smarter and to just cut the conversation short. So it kind of pulls all of our answers together. Yeah.
I just had a little comment and example to kind of add to what Celina and Nykkie just said in terms of not using complicated words. One of the, in one experience with a group of people, the aha moment, the bulb went on with the group when we used an analogy. It's like saying you're going up or down elevator. And you're going up or down elevator with bags. Okay, so we're not exactly talking about racism, but about inequities and how that works. So that sort of an analogy made the penny drop. And then it kind of, I believe it made the group more open to start thinking about, okay, how does this apply now? What's happened in the past? What's happened, that kind of thing. And these days, I think memes are super powerful. I mean, it is not to dilute, it's not to dumb down, but it does make a way of connecting with an audience, which is very non-academic, but I think it opens those doors to those conversations in ways that words alone can't. So those are just my couple of examples to add to what you said. Thank you.
Thanks, Manas.
Okay, if there are no other immediate questions, I'd really like to hear from the panelists in terms of what might be advice, next steps, action for people to move forwards.
Hmm. take the tackling structural racism course. Well, that's no.
Or any takeaways?
Be open to learning. Be open to asking questions, calling your friends in when, being able to take criticism yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, jokes apart, I think one of the things that I've found very difficult as someone who comes from a minority community, but has adapted and has been integrated into Canadian and Quebec life because of a distinct advantage of living in a Francophone household, is that it's important to acknowledge that particular privilege, if we call it, but also to not decry some of the ways in which I haven't been treated equitably, despite those privileges. So finding perhaps a platform to be able to share that without necessarily having too much rancor about it has been the biggest problem for me. I hold a lot of ill will. I find it very difficult to forgive, but I forget very quickly. Very difficult to forgive. And that's something I think you work on personally. And as a pedagogue, as somebody who works in the broader field of prevention of xenophobia or discrimination, you definitely want to encourage those conversations, all the while acknowledging that there is a personal toll to the work that we do. I definitely feel it, more than 10 years into this, I feel a personal toll, but I'm also very proud that we have a sustained leadership that's built within our work, whether it's the collaborations we engage in with you, whether it's the work we're doing on the ground here in Montreal. There's sustained leadership. I don't feel the pressure of having to lead this work because there's a diffused sense of ownership of these projects. So that's been really, really helpful. Yeah, that's kind of a very personal takeaway, which I don't think I've shared before.
I always just tell my friends to be prepared to listen, to push yourself to just listen to people, listen to their stories. And especially if you're a white settler, is to just understand that there are certain spaces that are not requiring you to speak or to take up spaces, just to listen. And that's what a lot of people want. We just want you to listen. And it's to be okay being wrong, and it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I think that's what I always tell people is just, you're going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. And it's to just push yourself to pick up different books, to read, to have conversations, to attend events like this, to take classes online, that are either free or where you have to pay a little bit, but that will benefit you in the long run. I think it's always just thinking about it, not in a way that you're gonna, put yourself in a position where you realize, oh, I'm dumb or I didn't know this. No, it's to look at it as this is a way, an opportunity for me to grow and to learn as an individual and to be a better relational, a better relative to others. So yeah.
I guess to tie up what we're all saying is get out of your echo chamber, whether that's on your phone or in your personal life. And it's, being open to learning and listening, and not always necessarily at a high academic or, conceptual level, but like with memes, right? Try different foods, just learn about different people. Because at the end of the day, if you can connect, if you can find that, those different connections, laugh together, right? That will go a lot further sometimes than focusing on difference.
And as much as the internet is a cesspool, getting out of your echo chamber is very much facilitated through the internet. Watch an interview with someone whose ideals you don't necessarily agree with. You can shout at the video, they can't hear you. And that's okay. You can get upset with it, but maybe keep an open mind about what are the things they're talking about? Why do they think that way? We know you disagree with them. We get it. But don't necessarily get into this habit of saying, I refuse to negotiate this. Yeah, so use the cesspool to your advantage.
So we have a comment and then a final question.
I also wanted to, there was an Indigenous writer, Samantha Knock, who wrote also about witnessing, and it's huge. I also carry this with me in all of my work and my writing and because whenever you work with racialized communities, Indigenous communities, any kind of community, again, because the stories are individual, it ties, I think it ties back what you were saying in the beginning of how one person does not represent an entire community or an entire religion or an entire ethnicity or whatever, right? So witnessing is very important. And Nock wrote about how when you listen to the stories, be it memes or videos or reading an academic paper, when you're listening to somebody's story, like really listen to it, absorb it, be changed by it. And then it's okay if when you retell the story takes some elements of you, and it's okay because you've been modified by that story and you're bringing it with you. And so that witnessing stories is such a powerful thing to also remember when we're delving deep into the cesspool and otherwise. Thanks.
Thank you, Raga.
And we have a last question from one of our afternoon panelists, Paul.
You're so lucky. Oh my God. So I think just the last sort of rounding thing about, because this is about Indigenous, structural racism, like anti-Indigenous racism that is so structural to Canada and to these settler colonial societies, right? And like, this is about, exceptionalism of whiteness and all these things. And it gets so heavy. But I would love to ask all of you, where do you find your joy in this work? Because we're not all like, these are heavy things and they affect us deeply. And also it affects our ancestors and, the people in front of us and behind us, right? But we are also joyous people, right? BIPOC people are joyous people, actually. So I would love to hear, reflections on joy. And again, maybe tying it back to what the way Celina was talking about, maybe I'm not about resiliency, like I loved what you said about resiliency, right? So yeah, where do you find your joy in this really important work? Merci.
I know for myself, it's always keeping in mind that I'm doing this, not just for myself, but I'm doing it for my family members that are no longer here. And that's how I find joy, because I understand it's such a privilege for me to be in academia and to be in this space. And simultaneously, even though it's difficult, I find joy knowing that good is going to come out of it. And that's the thing, is that with the work that I do, I want to be able to change things, and I want to be able to help Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited folks. So that's what keeps me going, and that's how I find joy. And also, having an awesome supervisor brings me joy too, because it helps a lot. And it's like, we can have these conversations and I can say, this is really tough. And then we find a solution to that. And I can find joy knowing that I'm being listened to, that I'm being supported. And it's also understanding that this work isn't like to not just lose myself in it, but to do things on the side. So to keep up that joy, I dance jingle dress and I'm getting back into it. And that's what helps. Smudging helps. Being with my dad, being with my family, just little things like that, watching my favorite movies. That's how I maintain that joy aspect in my research. But ultimately, it's keeping in mind that I'm doing this for my family. That's what keeps me going. Yeah.
That's really great. And the self-care piece is very important. I could echo what Celina said, but I'll add on, especially as a professor, as lead of different projects. If I did this work alone, I think I would have a different answer. So where the joy comes from is the relations. It's with the people I'm working with, right? So not only my colleagues in academia, but also when we're working with community members. There is a lot of solidarity among different BIPOC groups. And so it's not like us against the world, right? But we can even find some dark humor and some laughs in some of these things, and be able to even relieve some of the stress that, could keep us up all night, but to share that common experience and, have a laugh, have some tea, right? And do this kind of work. These different collaborations, even like us being here in Montreal, right? Expanding our network and even out of our own echo chamber of our own head, right? But it's the work with others, right? And it's that laughing and even sharing of some of the dark stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the one thing that comes to mind is separating who I am as a person, my own identity, the way I frame it in complex ways from the work that I do. I think for me, that's very, very crucial. And yeah, just what actually brings me joy is being able to take care of my own mental health, whether it's making sure I see a mental health professional to be able to negotiate some of these challenges is really important. Separating myself from the phenomenon. So not defining my work and my being by these acts is very, very important to me. Yeah. Thank you.
And that's rare in academia, right? A lot of times their identity is completely tied up in work, but you're a person outside of your job. Yeah. Very well put, Vivek.
Thank you. Great question. So maybe just take a moment to give a little plug to the micro course. Nykkie, do you want to speak to this?
Sure. So we've been talking about tackling structural racism. We've been talking about the course for the last couple hours. If you are online right now, there's a link to our continuing education piece. The next offering is in April. So April 8th to June 14th is the official registration. It's self-paced. So sometimes, depending on what your work schedule is, your work-life balance, some folks just work through a module a week and they're done in 4 weeks. Others do a bit at a time. All of the course is narrated as video with audio as well. So if you're a podcast kind of person, this is something, while you're getting ready in the morning, you could listen to and engage, or, it's easy reading on your, on your commute. Yeah, and the course is open to everyone. Check it out online. We actually do have other online courses that we offer as well. That's up on your screen now. Indigenous Peoples and Canada, most famously co-narrated a couple years ago with Dan Levy with a YouTube series there. So he's not on these videos. But there's a set of YouTube videos on that, as well as our courses that we offer to higher ed students for university credit or as a professional development piece. So that's Indigenous people in techno science. Usually we're thought of as something in education or cultural studies, as I mentioned. Yes, there's a whole science to indigeneity that you can learn about, as well as countering stereotypes. So learning where myths and stereotypes come from.
Congrats on these achievements. It's fantastic and such an inspiration for us here to learn from this work. Thank you.
Yep, there will be a French version available soon as well, which you can sign up for more information about. So I'd just like to take a moment to thank Nykkie, Celina, and Vivek for speaking so passionately and so interestingly. Thank you to the Fourth Space for hosting us yet again, and to Manis, Rauda, and Safia, who have been working very hard in the background, especially with the folks on Zoom. And I think that's about it. So thank you.
And thank you to you, Kathryn Urbaniak, who's really masterminded this entire operation for today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Woo.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming in for today's event and activating this conversation. Everyone online and those of you in your space, just thank you for all the questions, also just the engagement. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but just a quick reminder, this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it there. And please join us again this afternoon for Dévoiler l'équité, lutter contre le racisme structurel, or some other time soon, hopefully. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.